Welcome to She Moves Bravely, a podcast dedicated to empowering women through stories of resilience, courage, and success. I'm your host, Shantae Dent. Hello, listeners. I am excited about today's conversation. We get to engage in conversation with a woman who's moved bravely in a unique way. Mary Harper's childhood is different than most of us, but she has an incredible story to tell. Mary, welcome to the She Moves Bravely podcast. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for being willing to share your story. I love the concept of encouraging women through various stories to give them hope for whatever it is that they are experiencing. So, Mary, I'm going to pass the baton to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've navigated your unique childhood, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, my first thought when I saw the title of your podcast, She Moves Bravely, I didn't think of myself. I thought of my mother. My mother was the one who was incredibly brave. And I'll be talking about her later too, about how she overcame so much. And her childhood was so difficult because she was born with glaucoma. It was quite obvious when she was born that her eyes were enlarged and that there was something wrong. So she had many, many challenges every single minute. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, every once in a while she had a challenge. It was every day, every minute. She had to be on guard about different things. So moving bravely through life, she really taught me a lot of good lessons.
Yeah.
Patience, creativity, organization, love. She was an incredible person. So uh, sometimes I think, well, my childhood was definitely different, but I don't know, somehow I picked my parents to be the right ones for me. They they taught me a lot, and all through it, I felt love. So that was a sustaining force, even through the tougher times. It was different. I mean, how many 4-year-olds guide their parents? I mean, I would learn from a very early age how to walk with them and walk safely. So I learned that I had to walk to the curb with my mom. She would take my left arm with her right hand like this, and we'd start off down the sidewalk. But every time I would come to a curb or a break in the sidewalk, I would stop and I would tell her, oh, this is just the average curb, or this is a high one that you have to step down, or there's water there. You need to just make sure you take a big step and then you'll miss the water. So not many 4 and 5-year-olds do that. Not many other kids are asked by their parents, do I have any spots on my dress? How about my tie? That would be my dad. My dad would always worry about spilling soup or something on his tie. So that was different. And then the fact that my dad was heavily involved in politics, local politics in Muncie, Indiana, and he had a big, beautiful guide dog all the time I was around anyway. He was very recognizable. Everybody in town of Muncie, Indiana knew who Mario Peroni was. So as a result, everybody knew, well, a lot of people knew that I was their daughter, and as kids, we had to be careful with our behavior. We had to be clean. We had to be very polite. We had to be aware of our mother's fear, which was if it looked like that she couldn't handle us as kids, CPS could come and take us away. And that was my mother's biggest fear, that simply because she was blind, people didn't think she could handle kids, and therefore we should all go off, be adopted somewhere else. So we behaved, at least.
Yeah. I bet.
Yeah.
So, growing up in this household where both of your parents are blind, and you mentioned being a 4-year-old helping, assisting your mom cross the street. So, I am intrigued. Like, tell us more. Like, when did that reality come into light where you realized I'm going to have to mature fairly quickly in order to lead the way for both, not one, but both of my parents?
I think I was born into it. I really do. I think I'm sort of an old soul, what they call an old soul, because it just came naturally to me. It was nothing I ever questioned. I mean, it was just part of life. That's what you do. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I will say this, when we got older, more in our adolescence, and I don't think my parents ever knew we did this, but there were four of us. And if one of us didn't want to walk with my dad or my mom or whatever, we just wanted to be free to walk by ourselves. It was when it was time for us to go someplace, and we'd be pointing at each other. Your turn, your
Your
turn.
turn. Your turn.
I'm like, your turn to walk.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, but we did it all by hand signals. They wouldn't.
Lovely. Well, and that's lovely that you all were able to have moments of humor. And I feel like, and you tell me the reality on a day-to-day basis where you mentioned you grew into it. So it wasn't as if it was a major shock where you had to transition from one lifestyle to another or go
No,
through some in-depth training. Like it was just natural progression. And
yeah.
and and with that story that you just shared, what was it like in terms of challenges, or were there any moments? I think you may have probably be favored by the position you all were in, mentioning your dad's role in the community being well known. So you tell me, did that work for you or against you?
Oh boy. When I was my late teens, I could not wait to get out of Muncie, Indiana, because everybody knew who it was, and my parents loved that. They loved
Mm,
being identified and stuff. But I wanted to just go to a store and not have anybody know me.
yeah.
So, but it does work in your favor when you walk into the store. My mother liked it. There's a beautiful old department store downtown Muncie. You'd
Mm,
go in, and she wanted to get some perfume or her hosiery, and they would say, "Hello, Mrs. Baroni, and what can I do for you today?" And
mm,
everybody knew who she was.
yeah.
So, yeah, it comes to your advantage sometimes. And sometimes in high school, I had a really smart older sister who was 10 years older than me. And the
Mhm.
teachers remembered her, how good she was in classes. So I said, well, I benefited from that. Let me put it that way.
You wrote a book about your story, The Sound of Her Voice, my blind parent's story. What can readers expect from that book?
Ooh. I've gotten so much feedback of people saying, oh, they cried, they were
Hmm.
inspired, they laughed. And I'm like, wow, if I had sat down to write an inspirational book, I'd still be looking at the screen right now and it'd be blank because I write an inspirational book. I don't know. But my parents' stories were so good. I knew they had to be written
Ooh,
down. I didn't want them to be forgotten. I
yeah.
didn't want them to be lost. I have two kids and two grandchildren, and I just first off started it for them.
Mhm.
In the book, I include photos, and I know that people a lot of times don't know what a Braille typewriter looks like. So I took a picture of my dad's old Braille typewriter and put that in.
Amazing.
Pictures of my parents and us, just to make it more real. Um, okay, so it's hard to know where to start. There's so many stories. But as I said, my mom was born in a farm in central Indiana in 1913, and 4 months later, in 1914, January, my dad was born 60 miles away. Both of them were born with glaucoma and very enlarged eyes. So the parents knew immediately at birth there was definitely something wrong.
Yeah.
It was interesting to compare the two families. My mom was, down to earth farm kind of people and just real practical. And their doctor said, I'll check, but I don't think there's anything that can be done. And he
Mm,
came back later and said, yes, I was right. My consultant in the big city of Indianapolis said, don't take her to all kinds of doctors. Don't waste your money. She will be blind, and there's nothing you can do. On the other hand, my grandmother, who on the other side, my dad's parents, were Italian immigrants, very devoted Catholics, and believed in miracles, and decided that she would do anything she could do
yeah.
to save my dad's sight. He had a tiny bit, not much.
Mhm.
And so she took him all over the place, and he hated it because they would give him these painful eye drops. And then she took him to a surgeon in Indianapolis who said, oh, yeah, I can fix him.
Mm,
and he made it even worse. He botched it badly.
my goodness.
Oh, when in like 1919, you're four
Yeah.
and 5 years old,
Mhm.
having your eyes
Yeah.
operated on.
Yeah.
I can't
Mhm.
imagine. My poor dad.
My goodness. Yeah, that's a
It,
lot.
it was a lot. And his last memory of seeing anything, he remembered their house was down by the train yards, and there would be coal cars along on the siding and snow. So he remembered seeing snow on top of the train cars, snow
Mhm.
on top of the black coal. And he said that was his last memory, seeing white on black.
Wow.
So if you asked him, he really didn't have the concept of red. He knew red was a fire truck, but he didn't know colors, didn't really care. That wasn't his thing. But
Mm,
my mom had enough sight that she kept her, she knew she could see well enough
mhm,
colors. And she went to elementary school for like 3 years. And that was pretty much a waste of time because back then they didn't know how to teach blind kids, certainly not in the public school.
mhm,
So that was very frustrating for her. And she'd come home all the time with headaches, poor thing, because
mhm,
she was squinting and working so hard to see, and she couldn't keep up with kids. So my grandfather, her father, found out about a school for the blind in Indianapolis. So she was so excited to go there because there'd be more people like her there.
mhm, mhm,
While all that was going on, my dad was growing up and being carted all over the place to different doctors trying to get a miracle. She even took him back to Italy right after the World War I, when it finally got safe to travel. They went back and he went to a different doctor there. And I'm
mhm,
sorry, Miss Roney. And then she still didn't accept defeat, so she took him up to a faith healer that was up in the mountains of
mhm.
Italy.
Yeah.
And I said, I knew my sight wasn't going to come back, but I had to do it because my mom wanted me
Mhm.
to. And
Yeah.
so, he was like, can I go play now? He had an older brother that they had an incredible amount of adventures, which I document in the book. There's a lot of stories about my dad driving a jalopy and with his brother's help and climbing up the skeleton of a building that was 4 stories high, uh, just literally on the steel beams. He did unbelievable stuff. And he would go by himself all around the town of Muncie, Indiana. He knew where everything was. He knew where the curbs were. He knew where the potholes were. He would walk by himself from their house, which was just outside of downtown, to where his dad's um, confectionery shop was. They sold homemade ice cream and homemade candies there. Um, so my dad was extremely independent.
It sounds like an adventurous life to me. And
Well, much more than me.
it sounds so adventurous. And even with all the details you shared so far, Mary, I love number one that you wrote this book and it began as a legacy, and clearly it has touched all readers. And when we started the podcast, you said initially it was my mom who came to mind in terms of moving bravely. And
Mhm.
what I hear is your entire family moved bravely. And even with your four, I can envision little Mary, 4 years old, assisting mom across the street. That's brave right there. And such a beautiful example of love. And this is what speaks volume to me when it comes to this word bravery, that the definition can vary for all people. And
Mhm.
I just love the manifestation of what bravery can look like, especially when we're looking at it like, oh, that was no big deal. That's just what we did. And
Right.
externally, we're thinking, what?
Right.
That's a
How
big
did they do
deal.
that?
Yeah.
And the desire to live a normal life was
Mm,
huge. And but back then, blind people didn't get married. Are you kidding?
mm,
Well, how would they support themselves? And, oh
mhm.
my God, they couldn't possibly take care of children. So
Yeah.
they were quite the pioneers and quite brave to be able to do what they did.
Mhm.
When my dad fell in love with my mom when he heard the sound of her voice, that was in the fourth grade, and that's
Oh
why I
my.
titled the book "The Sound of Her Voice," because she stood up and recited a poem, and my father heard the poem, memorized it, and almost recorded it in his brain. So
Mhm.
when he was lonely all the time, until he finally got married, he said, it brought me so much comfort to hear her
Love
voice.
it.
It's a sweet, it's a love
It
story.
is.
It
It
really
really
is.
is. And you
Yeah.
said that was fourth grade?
Fourth grade at
Fourth grade.
Indianapolis in the School for the Blind, which is an interesting place back in the early 20s. Uh, they had the boys on one side and the girls on the other side of the classroom. The
Mhm.
boys and girls were not allowed to talk to each other. They had to be careful walking down the hallways because the boys were on one side, the girls were on the other. They had separate dining rooms, separate dorms, separate playgrounds. They just couldn't be together.
Mhm.
So um, it wasn't until late middle school and high school that they were allowed to have like 3 dances a year, and they were very well supervised, of course.
Yeah.
But and they were not allowed to talk to each other. So my parents devised some very interesting ways of being able to communicate with each other, because that
Mhm.
was, of course, before you couldn't call. Nobody had a cell phone. Nobody had computers. Nobody had anything. Only they were taught
Mhm.
the Braille typewriter and also the print typewriter. So when they got to college, that's how they took their test, was with the print typewriter. They would go clack, clack, clack. And one funny story, where my dad went to college was, and mom too, was in Muncie at a place called Ball State University. Well, now it's Ball State University. It used to be Ball State Teachers College back then. But they would take classes, and my dad would have maybe a true false kind of test, and he'd be clicking away. And the students realized, oh, they just listened to the patterns of what he was doing. And
Mhm.
everybody in the class started getting A's. And the professor was like, how did this happen? They were all copying my dad.
That's one way of cheating, huh?
Yeah, a pretty clever way of cheating.
Yes. Oh my. Well, again, it just sounds like such an adventurous upbringing. And clearly, it had its challenges. But I believe, again, that's the beauty of life, where we
Yeah,
can learn how to adapt and make the best of our circumstances. And in your family situation, clearly, I see it, I hear it loud and clear. It was love, the foundation, love leading the way. Now,
yeah,
Mary, you made a statement in terms of you couldn't wait to leave. And eventually you did. You did leave eventually. Let's talk about what the adult years of your life looked like.
yeah. That's sort of interesting. Yeah, I didn't think twice about going off to college. I went away. The school was about 90 miles away, so I felt like it was away, but I could always come back home, which I did, back and forth. Um, and I got married fairly early. I got married at 19. I wasn't even 20 yet, but mom and dad, I never felt guilty leaving them. I mean, it was like, by then they were busy with my oldest sister, who was back home, and she's going through a divorce, had 2 kids, and they brought her home and said, come on, we'll babysit the kids and do whatever you need. And she went back to school and got her PhD. So,
Yeah.
uh, they did whatever needed to happen, and I never worried about them. They just, everything went on like normal.
Yeah.
Um, so life goes on. I'm married, and later on, I moved to North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is a beautiful little town. By that time, my dad was nearing 65, and he was getting ready to retire. And my mom kept saying on the phone, Mary, I don't know what I'm going to do with your dad. He's just going to drive me nuts when he gets home, when he's retired. He's just going to hang around and bug me. And I just don't know what to do with him. So then I said, well, you know what, Mom, I am pregnant and I'm due right after he retires. So do you want to move down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina? I was shocked when they said yes.
Look at there.
So literally, I went out and found a house. And the very first one I looked at was, I said, this is their house. This was perfect for them.
Yeah.
And they bought this house sight unseen. Ha ha, get the point. That's a terrible pun.
You were
But
too.
they had not been there. And they use the word seen. So I see a lot, and they use normal words. You don't have to worry about talking.
Mhm.
I shouldn't say that to a blind person.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I just use
That's a good
regular
point.
words.
Yeah, yeah.
So they moved in. 18 months later, I've had the baby. Everything's going great. My husband comes home one day and says, being recruited to go down to Houston. I'm like, what?
Mm,
I
mm,
didn't move to
mm.
Houston. Oh, dear God, I really didn't move to Houston. But I had to say goodbye. And that is my adult life. I felt so guilty leaving them behind.
Mhm.
And they said, no, I don't want to move to Houston. We're so happy in this house.
Yeah.
And I said, but how are we going to manage? Because I paid their bills. took him to the grocery, took him to the doctor. I did all
Mhm.
the kind of transportation stuff.
Yeah.
And they said, we'll manage. Don't worry, we managed before. And they did. They loved it. They were able to stay there 20 years. And by that,
Whoa. Yeah,
yeah,
nice.
yeah. So they were like 85. My mom was about 84 or so, and she was failing. Her kidneys were functioning not well. And dad says, I don't know what to do. I can't
Mhm.
take care of her myself. Dad had a brilliant mind, but when it came to the kitchen, he could open a can. That's about it. Yeah, so he wasn't much of a cook, whereas my mom had always done the cooking. So I convinced them to come down to Houston, and I found them an assisted living place, which they didn't really need much assistance, but they needed a place that would serve food and all that. And if they needed help, they would have it.
Yeah.
So then I spent a lot of time caregiving with them and taking them to doctors, and but I enjoyed that. You know what? I didn't mind that at all. I quit my job because I knew it would take too much time. I hated it anyway. So it was like, bye, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I was happy to leave. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, yeah. So it's interesting how, as an adult, my view of them changed. Used to be, I'd be pretty impatient. You know, mom would say, well, how do you put away that silverware so fast? Well, I don't know, I just throw it in there. But she had to feel each utensil. She had to feel the
Yeah.
fork, feel the shape, and then she had to reach down and feel for where to put it. And
Mhm.
I didn't have to do all that. I just dump it all in. That's one little example. Things took them a lot longer than it would a sighted person.
Yeah.
But, they were used to it, and that was just the way life was. And that's what you did. But she was always amazed when I was around. Then, when my dad especially was ill in his later part of his life, and he was moving slower and slower, and it was so important to him to be able to walk and exercise and be independent. I'm like, but dad, here's a wheelchair. You could get in there and we'd go for a ride, and I can get you there real fast. Oh, I think I'd rather walk. So, and watching my father, he was diagnosed very late with diabetes. He's a blind man, learning how to give himself insulin, how to test himself, how to, oh my gosh. And on top of that, he had an essential tremor. So he would shake, and oh my God, I feel so bad. And I'm thinking, okay, we have to get to that doctor appointment pretty quick. And he's forever, and but he's going to walk. So that's what I learned. I realized, okay, none of that's important. I just have to
Mhm.
allow extra time,
Yeah.
take my time. It's his dignity. It was
Mm.
him being able to do it
Able
for
to.
himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So important, all the way to the very end. He was
Mm.
that way. He was very, um,
Yeah.
very independent. At this assisted living, they couldn't believe that he could take his own medicine. Oh yeah, no, I don't want anybody giving me my medicine. Mm-mm.
It is
He had all those
unbelievable.
medicine bottles, and my mom too,
Yeah.
labeled. So he knew what was what, and he would put it in a special place, and he had no problem taking his own
Mm.
medicine.
Wow, that's inspiring. Makes you feel anything is possible. You're just hearing, the
Yeah. Hey, when he was
capabilities.
90, he said,
Yeah.
hey, Mary, I haven't read Greek mythology in a long time. I think I'm going to get that out of the library. I'm like, okay, Dad, go for it. I don't care
You
anything about
gotta
Greek
love it.
mythology.
Gotta love it.
Yeah. So he
So,
did reading and all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
like you learned how to exercise patience.
Yeah.
What other lessons or areas do you feel might have been amplified due to your unique upbringing?
I don't know if that was naturally born with empathy, but man, I've got it in spades.
Yeah.
That's one of those things I really understand people, and I'm not psychic, but I just feel like I'm perceptive.
Mhm.
And I think my parents were very perceptive.
Yeah.
Uh, Dad would ask he's a judge, and he would ask his bailiff or court reporter for um, not advice, but to describe things for him. If he wasn't quite sure if a person was telling the story, he
Mhm.
might ask, well, what did his face look like? What was his expression look like?
Mhm.
And the other thing he did, he had a big rule, never ever oil the witness chair, because people who are lying often move around a lot. And he could tell by the squeaking of the chair that I
Yeah.
was suspicious.
Look at theirs.
Yeah.
Okay. I love it. Yeah. It's interesting how, we can look at someone and feel like, oh, that's a disability, they're disabled, but here it is, they learn how to navigate through life
Oh
and
yeah.
ways better than we can, those of us who do have sight.
And he taught me to listen. They
Yeah,
both did.
yeah.
That, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many people that don't listen. I mean, I was out with a friend, we were bird watching, and I said, "Oh, listen." And but she kept on talking, talking, talking. I was like, I just want you to shut up for a second so I can hear this bird. What? There's a bird singing? So
Oh,
yes, shut up, please. So I was trying to be
I
polite, but
love
she
it.
wouldn't shut
Yeah.
up.
But
So
this,
I mean, I love nature. My dad loved nature. Even when he was in his 80s, we would take him on trips. I took him to Colorado and had
Mhm.
a little cabin next to a babbling brook. Oh, he loved to sit out there and listen to that
Yeah.
stream. It's stuff that people don't think about. And I always say, oh, listen to that. And they're like, huh? So yeah, they taught me a lot about appreciating nature, and then when he would want to see what a tree looked like, I'd take him over to this tree and he'd try to put his arms around it and say, "Oh, this is a really big tree. It must be really old." I think my dad was the original tree hugger.
Original tree hugger. Well,
Uh,
I love how you were able to have a greater appreciation for things that we would probably take for granted. The mindset that you have developed over the years, I'd love for you to share a few golden nuggets with the audience.
Woo. Now that's as much pressure as looking at a computer screen and writing something inspirational. I'm thinking, oh my God, what can I tell someone that's a golden nugget? Uh, a lot of people don't know how to approach a blind person. Um, and I think you have to treat people with any disability with respect and patience, but also just talk to them. I can't tell you how important it is just to come up and say, hello, I just saw you walking down the street and wanted to say hi, my name is. My dad used to tell the story about, and I was with him one time when we were downtown walking, going somewhere, and somebody comes up to him and says, "Hey, Mario, do you know who I am?" My dad, I could tell he's getting mad because his big eye got real big. He had one big eye and nothing over on this side. It was just empty and covered over with an eyelid. So he was sort of creepy looking. And I knew as soon as that eye went up like this, I was like, okay,
Mm,
mister, you've made it mad. Well, you don't go up to a blind person and say, "Do you know who I am?"
mm,
Now,
mm.
my dad was famous in Muncie for knowing people's voices. When
Okay.
he was a student at Notre Dame University in the law school, there was a little article written about him in the South Bend Tribune newspaper back in 1938 or whatever. And it said, Mario Peroni, law student, blind law student, knows 150 voices. So if you go up and talk to him, he would know your voice. He would know who you are. So he'd always had that ability to recognize people's voices. And it's something that I also am really good at identifying voices. I may not remember your name, but I sure remember your voice. Or I'll
Incredible.
notice someone's voice and I'll think, "Oh, you'd be a good singer." But
Mm,
I hear inflections, I hear emotions. And my parents were, of course, they had to hear emotions in our voices. They couldn't see our expressions.
yeah.
So they could tell just by listening what mood we were in. So you think about it, I am terrible at looking at someone's face and knowing the exact emotion behind it. I
Mm,
didn't need to look at my parents' faces. In fact, my mom had glass eyes, and so there's no expression in those eyes. So I didn't need to really look, but I sure listened. And if I heard certain tones, I'm like, I'm
you
in trouble
knew.
now.
Mm.
But so I think it's so important that people miss out on things if
Yes,
you don't hear, if you don't listen, if you don't pay attention. And that's the thing. They had to pay attention
I did.
all the time. I
Yeah.
never realized it until my dad was talking about it, how much work it was for him to even walk with the dog, even
Mm,
going up. We lived on a busy street. So all he had to do is go down the sidewalk and take off for downtown. And I was like a mile and a half away. So he would walk a lot to get exercise. And he had to concentrate every minute. Yes, he had to listen out for traffic. He
mhm.
had to know what street he was at. He had to know the order of the streets so that he wouldn't get lost because he knew that. it would be the most humiliating thing in the world to be lost. You don't
Mm.
want to be lost.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he was way too proud for that. In the appendix in my book, I include a chapter. I transcribed this story and wrote it down so that it would be his voice telling this story. And it was a story of, and everybody who was in Indiana in 1978 remembers this big blizzard. And my dad had been stuck inside for a long time, days, and had to take the dog out and decided to go for just a short walk. But on that short walk, he got lost. All the sounds were different in the sound because if you've ever walked in snow, things sound very different. And he didn't know where he was. And he thought, I cannot die out here because if I do, then the headline will say Mr. Peroni dies in a blizzard, and he would be totally humiliated.
Mm.
So he tells the story of how he got back to the house. But I think that was one reason why they decided to move to North Carolina, where it would be a little bit warmer.
Yes, yes, indeed. Gosh, Mary, so many incredible points. And you came up with a good golden nugget. I mean, these takeaways, number one, just being patient and learning how to listen. But I love the golden nugget when you talked about approaching someone who's blind or any difference for that matter.
Yeah.
It's okay to talk to them. You don't have to treat them differently in an awkward way. Just talk to them as you would anyone else that you would come across in passing. And that's solid information, Mary, because there are a lot of people that either they get uncomfortable or they're not
Yeah.
sure what to say, so they don't say anything at all.
Yeah.
It's refreshing. They're human beings, just like you're a human being, and just
100%.
strike up a conversation.
That's right. Can I
Yeah.
add one quick thing?
You sure
Uh,
can.
Thank you. People don't realize that anyone with any disability has a hard time getting out or running errands or going to the grocery store. So offering a ride and taking them to the grocery store, for example, hugely important and just a wonderful thing to do. Um, I do that now. A friend of mine said his friend was going blind, and I said, "Well, pick him up and take him to the meeting. You don't have to. I mean,
Oh,
he needs a ride." He was
yeah.
so grateful.
I
No,
like that.
oftentimes people don't realize they don't think about someone needing a ride
Yeah,
or getting out of the house. So
I
offer
like
them to
that.
go somewhere. Yeah,
Offer them a ride, help them get out of the house, go for a walk with them at the park, anything.
yeah. Read them a story. Read them
Yeah,
something that they can't read themselves,
good. I
or
like
read them their mail.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's
Yeah,
just infinite numbers of things you can just ask what do you need,
yeah.
and they'll
Just
tell you.
and I like that. Just ask because sometimes they may not want to ask. They might not want to be a burden, or like you said with your dad, he's like, nope,
100%.
pride, pride won't.
Oh, nobody didn't want to be a
Yeah,
burden. No, no,
nope.
no. So we were very independent. We had to take the bus or a taxi or walk or
Yeah,
ride our bike.
yeah, yeah.
We didn't want to call up and say, "Hey, can you give me a ride?" No way.
Mhm. Oh my. Well, good stuff here, Mary. And thank you for sharing the story. It's inspiring. How can individuals purchase your book?
It's on Amazon, also Barnes and Noble. They can also go to my website, and there's links there. My website is pretty easy to remember. It's just my name, Maryp, but you got to get that P in there, harper.com.
Excellent, excellent. So Mary's book can be purchased on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's called The Sound of Her Voice, My Blind Parent's Story. Mary, thank you for being with us today. Keep moving bravely.
Yeah. Thank you.